Hello dear students, in the last period we have studied that if we have a strong base NaOH and if we have a strong acid HCl, from base the positive ion or cation comes, and from the acid the negative ion or anion comes, and then the salt is formed. The salt formed by the strong base and strong acid is the neutral salt, and water is also produced. So now we can study in detail about the various salts. In salts we have cation from the base and an anion from the acid. Knowing the above knowledge, we can find out from which acid the salt is being produced and from which base we can produce the from what kind of acid and what kind of base we can produce a salt. Knowing the above knowledge, we can find out from which acid the salt is being prepared, and thus we can even think or determine if the salt is acidic in nature or basic in nature or neutral in nature. So we can determine that from which acid or which base the salt is produced, and we can even determine that whether the given salt is acidic or basic or neutral by knowing from which salt they are produced, and if the salt from which acids and base the salt is produced, and if the salt the nature of salt depends upon the nature of the acid and base from which the salt is produced. Let us study about the salt. Let's think of first the potassium nitrate. Potassium nitrate is KNO3, that has the K plus potassium ion and NO3 minus nitrate ion. The K plus potassium ion comes from KOH and the NO3 minus comes from HNO3. KOH is a strong base and HNO3 is a strong acid, and that is why this is the combination of strong base and strong acid, and that is why potassium nitrate is a neutral salt. This is how we can easily understand. You can even understand, my dear students, that you can add just the OH minus, required OH minus to the cation and required H to the anion, so that we can get the base and acid produced from the salt. Same way, if we think of the salt named aluminium chloride, we can think of aluminium plus 3 ions and 3 Cl minus ions. Aluminium plus 3 ion has AlOH thrice, which is a weak base, and Cl minus is coming from HCl, which is a strong acid. Thus weak base and strong acid forms the acidic salt, and our AlCl3 would be an acidic salt. Same way, if we think about zinc sulfate has Zn plus 2 and SO4 minus 2 ion. Zn plus 2 comes from the base ZnOH twice, whereas SO4 minus 2 comes from the acid H2SO4. ZnOH twice is a weak base, whereas H2SO4 is a strong acid. So ZnSO4 is the salt that is coming from the weak base and strong acid, and that is why it is an acidic salt. This is how we can say that zinc sulfate is an acidic salt. Same way, if we think of the copper sulfate has 2 ions, Cu plus 2 and SO4 minus 2. Cu plus 2 comes from the CuOH twice, which is a weak base, whereas SO4 minus 2 comes from the H2SO4, which is a strong acid. Thus, copper sulfate is a salt from weak base and strong acid, and that is why copper sulfate is an acidic salt. Same way, if we think of sodium acetate, we can say that sodium acetate has the formula CH3COONA. It has Na plus as a cation and CH3COO minus as an anion. Na plus come from the NaOH, which is a strong base, whereas CH3COO minus comes from the CH3COOH, which is a acidic acid, and it is a weak acid. Thus, the sodium acetate is the salt of strong base and weak acid. That is why it is the basic salt. Same way, we can think of the sodium carbonate. Sodium carbonate has the formula Na2CO3. So it has 2 Na plus and CO3 minus 2. This Na plus comes from the strong base NaOH, whereas the CO3 minus 2 comes from the H2CO3, which is a weak acid. And that is why Na2CO3 or sodium carbonate is a salt from strong base and weak acid, and thus it is a basic salt that we can understand about the sodium carbonate Na2CO3. So my dear students, this is how we can understand the various about the various salts. Now we have an in-text question. Under what okay, now we can, sorry, this is the mistake. We can study about the more salt, my dear students. The next salt that we need to study about is the sodium hydrogen carbonate. It has the formula NaHCO3. It has two ions, positive ion that is Na, and negative ion is the hydrogen carbonate ion, HCO3 minus. Na comes from the strong base NaOH, and HCO3 minus comes from the H2CO3 or HHCO3. This is your weak base, and that is why NaHCO3 is the base of strong base and weak acid, and that is why NaHCO3 is a basic salt. Same way, my dear students, we can understand about ammonium chloride. Ammonium chloride has a NH4 plus and Cl minus. This NH4 plus comes from the NH4OH, which is a weak base, whereas Cl minus comes from the strong acid HCl, and that is how the acidic salt comes from. This is how we can get the this is ammonium chloride is the salt from weak base and strong acid, and that is why ammonium chloride is an acidic salt. And here we have an important note that NH4OH is nothing but the aqueous solution of ammonia, which is a weak base. You know, when NH3 is dissolved in water, it produces NH4OH, which is known as sometimes liquor ammonia too. So this is how. Now we can move to the next salt. The next salt is ammonium acetate. The formula of ammonium acetate is CH3COONH4. It has two ions, NH4 plus ion and CH3COO minus ion. NH4 plus ion comes from the NH4OH, whereas CH3COO minus ion comes from the CH3COOH. NH4OH is a weak base and CH3COOH is a weak acid, and that is why it is the salt from weak base and weak acid, and that is why it is a neutral salt. So we can say that ammonium acetate is a neutral salt. This is how we understand about the various salt, my dear students. We are going to study about the salts in detail into, or the same salts in a tabulated form into the next period, my dear students. I hope you are enjoying your studies. Happy learning.